September 8, 1944, 6:43 p.m. Winston Churchill sits at his desk in the Cabinet War Rooms beneath Whitehall, reading intelligence reports by the light of a green-shaded lamp. London is celebrating. Paris liberated 2 weeks ago. Allied armies racing across France. The V-1 flying bomb threat nearly eliminated. Victory seems close enough to taste. Then the building shakes. Not the familiar rumble of bombs falling, not the scream of air raid sirens, not the drone of German bombers overhead. Just a sudden, violent tremor that rattles the teacup on his desk and sends papers sliding to the floor. Silence. Then the boom arrives, rolling through the underground corridors like distant thunder, arriving seconds after the impact. Churchill's hand stops mid-sentence. His pen hovers over the paper. His private secretary, John Martin, appears in the doorway, face pale in the fluorescent light. Prime Minister, there's been an explosion. Chiswick. No warning. No aircraft detected. Churchill sets down his pen with deliberate care. He knows exactly what this means. 4 months, intelligence has warned about Hitler's new weapon. A rocket, traveling faster than sound. No defense. No warning. Just death falling from the edge of space. He stands, reaches for his jacket, and speaks the first words that will define Britain's response to the most advanced weapon of the war. Get me the details. Everything. And for God's sake, don't let the press know what hit them. To understand Churchill's response that evening, to grasp why those words mattered, you must understand what led to this moment and what hung in the balance. Since June 1944, London had endured the V-1 flying bomb campaign. The doodlebugs, or buzz bombs, terrified civilians but could be countered. Fighter pilots shot them down. Anti-aircraft guns destroyed them. Barrage balloons snagged them. Their pulse jet engines announced their approach. When the engine cut out, you had 15 seconds to take cover before impact. Terrifying, yes, but manageable. Churchill had weathered the Blitz. He had walked London's bomb streets, inspecting damage, rallying morale, projecting defiance. His speeches transformed destruction into resolve. His visible presence made him the embodiment of British determination. When bombs fell, Churchill was there. When fires burned, Churchill surveyed the damage. The image of Churchill with cigar, giving the V for victory sign amid rubble, became iconic. But intelligence reports throughout 1944 described something different. Something worse. German rocket development at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. A weapon called the A-4, later designated V-2 by Nazi propaganda. 46 feet tall. 13 tons of metal. Fueled by liquid oxygen and alcohol. Capable of reaching speeds over 3,500 miles per hour. Range of 200 miles. Warhead containing 1 ton of high explosive. Most terrifying, it arrived faster than sound. The explosion came before the sound of its approach. No air raid sirens. No time to take shelter. No defense. Just sudden, random death falling from 60 miles above the earth. The Royal Air Force had bombed Peenemünde in August 1943, delaying the program. Allied intelligence tracked every scrap of information. Polish resistance fighters recovered rocket parts and smuggled them to London. Photographic reconnaissance flights documented test launches. The intelligence was clear and disturbing. Hitler called it his Vergeltungswaffe, revenge weapon. He promised it would turn the tide of the war, force Britain to sue for peace, punish London for bombing German cities. Nazi propaganda described a miracle weapon that would rain destruction on England without warning or mercy. Churchill had received briefings throughout 1944. He knew the V-2 was real. He knew it was coming. He knew that when it arrived, Britain would face a weapon unlike anything in military history. A weapon against which there was no defense except to destroy the launch sites or overrun them with ground forces. The liberation of France had eliminated many V-1 launch sites. But the V-2 could be launched from mobile platforms. It could strike from Holland, from Germany itself. Allied armies were advancing, but not fast enough. Not before Hitler could deploy his rockets against London. Churchill faced a terrible choice. If he announced the V-2 threat publicly, panic might follow. London had endured 5 years of war. Morale was fragile despite recent victories. If the public knew that unstoppable rockets could strike at any moment, that no shelter offered protection, that death could arrive literally from space without warning, what would happen to British resolve? But if he concealed the truth, if explosions began occurring with increasing frequency, if rumors spread about mysterious blasts with no aircraft sightings, wouldn't that be worse? Wouldn't speculation and fear in the absence of facts prove more destructive than honesty? The stakes extended beyond London. Allied intelligence feared German rockets might carry chemical weapons or even radioactive materials. Scientists had warned that rocket technology represented a revolution in warfare. Today, conventional explosives. Tomorrow, something worse. The V-2 was not just a weapon. It was the future of warfare, arriving 5 years too soon. Churchill also understood the strategic calculation. Every V-2 launch diverted German resources from the collapsing eastern and western fronts. The rockets cost enormous sums to develop and produce. The liquid oxygen alone required massive industrial infrastructure. If Germany was spending resources on rockets instead of tanks and aircraft, that was strategically advantageous for the Allies. But that calculation meant nothing to the families who would die in the explosions. It meant nothing to Churchill's responsibility to protect British civilians. And it meant nothing if panic undermined the war effort at the moment when victory seemed closest. So Churchill waited. He prepared. He studied the intelligence. He consulted with scientific advisors. He developed response protocols. And he knew that when the first rocket fell, his words and actions would define Britain's response to terror from space. The explosion in Chiswick at 6:43 p.m. on September 8, 1944, killed 3 people and injured 17. The rocket struck Staveley Road, creating a crater 30 feet wide and 8 feet deep. Houses collapsed. Windows shattered across a quarter-mile radius. Civilians thought it was a gas main explosion. Local authorities reported it as such. The cover story was immediate and deliberate. Churchill received detailed reports within the hour. The explosion characteristics matched V-2 predictions exactly. The seismic signature. The lack of aircraft detection. The timing of boom after impact. Intelligence confirmed a V-2 launch from The Hague in occupied Holland at approximately 6:40 p.m. Flight time, 3 minutes. No warning. No defense. 16 seconds later, at 6:43 and 16 seconds, a second V-2 struck Epping, 17 miles northeast. This rocket malfunctioned, exploding in the air. The fragmentation pattern confirmed it was a rocket, not a bomb. 2 launches. 2 impacts. Hitler's promise fulfilled. Churchill spent the evening in emergency meetings. Military chiefs, intelligence officers, scientific advisors, civil defense coordinators. The discussions were urgent and frank. How many rockets could Germany produce? Intelligence estimated 20 to 30 per day initially, potentially more. Where were they launching from? Mobile platforms in Holland and Western Germany. How long would the campaign last? until Allied armies overruled the launch areas or until German production collapsed. What could be done? Very little. Fighter aircraft couldn't intercept projectiles traveling faster than sound. Anti-aircraft guns were useless against targets moving at 3,500 miles per hour. The only counter was to bomb the production facilities, disrupt supply chains, and accelerate the ground advance into Holland and Germany. Churchill made several decisions that night. First, maintain the cover story. Explosions would be attributed to gas mains or other causes. No public announcement of the V-2 threat. Second, accelerate Allied operations to capture launch areas. Third, intensify bombing of suspected V-2 production and supply facilities. Fourth, prepare civil defense for casualties without revealing the true cause. But the decision to conceal the truth troubled him. Churchill believed in honesty with the British people. He had never sugarcoated the war's dangers. His speeches acknowledged setbacks and losses. Concealment felt wrong, felt like betraying the trust he had built. His private secretary later recalled Churchill's words as the meeting concluded near midnight. "We must protect them from panic, but we cannot protect them from the truth forever. When we tell them, and we will have to tell them, they will need to hear that we did everything possible to spare them this terror." Over the following days, more rockets fell. September 9th, 1 rocket. September 10th, 3 rockets. September 11th, 2 rockets. Each explosion was officially blamed on gas leaks. The civilian population accepted these explanations at first. London had many old gas mains. Wartime maintenance was poor. Explosions were plausible. But rumors began circulating. Too many explosions. Too similar. Too sudden. No smell of gas. No fire, just blast damage. People whispered. They speculated. They feared. The government's silence bred conspiracy theories more frightening than the truth. Churchill visited bomb sites personally, maintaining his wartime practice of inspecting damage and meeting survivors. At Chiswick, he saw the crater, the collapsed buildings, the shattered lives. He spoke with civil defense workers who described the blast characteristics. He met with civilians who reported hearing the explosion before any sound of approach. One woman, pulling belongings from her damaged home, stopped Churchill and asked directly, "Prime Minister, what really happened here? This wasn't a gas main, was it?" Churchill met her eyes. His face, usually animated, went still. He couldn't lie directly to someone who had lost her home. But he couldn't reveal the truth either, not yet, not until the government decided on a public announcement strategy. "Madam, I promise you that you will know everything when we can tell you. Until then, please trust that we are doing everything in our power to protect London." The woman studied his face, then nodded slowly. "I do trust you, Mr. Churchill. But I'm not sure I trust the gas mains anymore." By mid-September, maintaining the fiction became impossible. Too many explosions. Too many witnesses. Too many inconsistencies. American correspondents in London were reporting on mysterious blasts. The BBC was receiving questions it couldn't answer. The cover story was collapsing under the weight of reality. Churchill faced the moment he had dreaded. He would have to tell the British people that a new weapon was falling on London. A weapon they couldn't see coming. A weapon against which there was no defense. A weapon that could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning. And he would have to do it in a way that informed without inducing panic, that acknowledged danger without surrendering to fear. The question was not whether to tell them. The question was what to say, and how to say it, so that Londoners would face this new terror with the same resolve they had shown during the Blitz. Churchill spent hours crafting his public statement. He consulted with advisors, revised drafts, weighed every word. The statement needed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. Acknowledge the V-2. Explain why the government had initially concealed it. Provide accurate information about the threat. Minimize panic. Maintain morale. Project confidence. And do all this while admitting that Britain faced an enemy weapon against which conventional defenses were useless. On November 10, 1944, 2 months after the first V-2 impact, Churchill rose in Parliament to make his statement. The timing was deliberate. By November, Allied armies were advancing into Holland. The end of the V-2 campaign was foreseeable. Morale was stronger with clear military progress. And the cover story had become untenable. His statement was characteristically Churchillian. Direct, honest, defiant. He confirmed that Germany had been using a long-range rocket against London and southeast England since early September. He acknowledged that these weapons had caused casualties and damage. He explained that the government had delayed public announcement to avoid assisting enemy targeting and to prevent alarm. But then Churchill did something remarkable. He minimized the weapon's strategic significance while acknowledging its terror. He stated that during the 2 months of V-2 attacks, far fewer people had been killed than during equivalent periods of the Blitz. He emphasized that the rockets, while frightening, were militarily insignificant compared to conventional bombing campaigns. The statistics supported him. From September 8 to November 10, approximately 500 V-2s had struck Britain, killing roughly 2,500 people. During the Blitz, that many died in single nights of bombing. The V-2 was a terror weapon, not a strategic weapon. It could kill. It could frighten. But it couldn't change the war's outcome. Churchill's tone conveyed contempt for the weapon and its creators. He described it as Hitler's desperation, the last gasp of a dying regime. He pointed out that Germany was using scarce resources to build rockets instead of defending against Allied armies. Every V-2 launched was one less tank or aircraft defending German soil. The press reporting on Churchill's statement emphasized his calm, his dismissal of the rockets as mere nuisances, his confidence in ultimate victory. Newspapers ran headlines like, "PM reveals robot weapon," and "Churchill belittles Hitler's rockets." The tone was dismissive, almost contemptuous. Public reaction proved Churchill correct. Londoners accepted the news with remarkable calm. They had endured worse. They trusted Churchill. And the V-2, while terrifying in its unpredictability, lacked the sustained terror of the Blitz when bombers came night after night. Random explosions were frightening, but they didn't create the sense of being under siege. Civil defense adapted. Rescue teams learned the blast patterns. Medical services prepared for the types of injuries V-2 explosions caused. Civilians developed the fatalistic humor that had sustained them through 5 years of war. Jokes circulated, "At least with a V-2, you never hear the one that gets you." But privately, Churchill's response was more complex. In conversations with advisors, he expressed frustration at fighting an enemy weapon he couldn't counter. The scientist and engineer in him, Churchill had always been fascinated by technology, appreciated the V-2's technological achievement even while deploring its purpose. He understood that rocket technology would dominate future warfare. He worried about implications beyond the current war. In a private letter to Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill wrote, "These rockets represent something new under the sun. We are witnessing the birth of a weapon that will change warfare fundamentally. I am glad we shall win this war before such weapons become truly effective. I shudder to think what the next war might bring." That letter revealed Churchill's deeper understanding. The V-2 wasn't just Hitler's revenge weapon. It was humanity's first step toward ballistic missiles, toward weapons that could cross continents, toward a future where no place on Earth would be safe from attack. Churchill saw not just the present threat, but the shadow it cast over the future. The V-2 campaign continued until March 27, 1945, when the last rocket struck London. In total, approximately 1,400 V-2s hit Britain, with about 500 striking London. They killed roughly 2,750 people and injured 6,500. Each death was a tragedy. Each family destroyed was a loss beyond statistics. But strategically, Churchill had been correct. The V-2 failed as a weapon of war. The resources Germany devoted to the V-2 program were staggering. Each rocket cost approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks, the equivalent of producing several fighter aircraft or tanks. The liquid oxygen production alone required massive industrial facilities. The precision manufacturing demanded skilled labor and scarce materials. Underground production facilities carved into mountains employed thousands of slave laborers under horrific conditions. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later admitted that the V-2 program was a strategic disaster for Germany. The resources consumed could have produced 24,000 additional fighter aircraft or thousands of tanks. Those conventional weapons might have prolonged the war significantly. The rockets, for all their technological sophistication, achieved little military value. But the V-2's impact extended far beyond World War II. The rocket technology developed at Peenemünde became the foundation of the space age and the ballistic missile age. After the war, both the United States and Soviet Union captured German rocket scientists, equipment, and documentation. Wernher von Braun, the V-2's chief designer, became the architect of America's space program. Soviet engineers studied captured V-2s to develop their own missiles. The ICBM, the space race, the moon landing, satellite technology, all descended directly from the V-2. Churchill's private concerns about future implications proved prescient. Within 15 years of the V-2's first flight, both superpowers possessed hydrogen bombs mounted on ballistic missiles capable of crossing oceans in minutes. The weapon that terrorized London in 1944 evolved into weapons that could destroy civilization. Churchill's response to the V-2 also established principles for managing public information during technological crises. His decision to delay announcement balanced security concerns with public trust. His eventual candor maintained credibility. His dismissive tone minimized panic while acknowledging reality. Future leaders facing novel threats, nuclear accidents, terrorism, pandemics, would study Churchill's handling of the V-2 announcement as a case study in crisis communication. The broader strategic lesson was darker. The V-2 demonstrated that technological sophistication doesn't guarantee military effectiveness. Germany produced a weapon decades ahead of its time. It worked exactly as designed. It terrorized civilians and showcased engineering brilliance. And it accomplished nothing militarily. It was the ultimate example of technology serving propaganda rather than strategy, of Hitler's obsession with wonder weapons diverting resources from rational defense. For Churchill personally, the V-2 campaign reinforced his understanding of modern warfare's character. Technology amplified destructive power, but human will remained decisive. The V-2 could kill from space, but it couldn't break British morale. Hitler's revenge weapons failed because the people they targeted refused to be terrorized into submission. Churchill's speeches during this period emphasized this theme. Science and technology were tools, but the human spirit determined their meaning. Britain possessed inferior weapons but superior resolve. Germany had technological marvels but moral bankruptcy. The war's outcome would be decided not by which side had better rockets, but by which side better understood what they were fighting for. Years after the war, Churchill reflected on the V-2 experience in his memoirs. His analysis was characteristically complex, acknowledging both the weapon's technical achievement and its strategic failure. He wrote that the V-2 represented both the apex of Nazi engineering and the nadir of Nazi strategic thinking. Brilliant men creating a weapon that cost more than it accomplished, serving a regime that had already lost the war. Churchill also reflected on his decision to conceal, then reveal, the V-2 threat. He defended the initial secrecy as necessary to prevent panic and avoid assisting enemy targeting. But he acknowledged the tension between his instinct for honesty and the practical requirements of wartime information management. The line between protecting the public and deceiving them was narrower than he liked. The woman in Chiswick who had questioned him about the gas main explanation appeared in his memoirs. Churchill wrote that her skeptical trust, believing him even while doubting the cover story, represented the British public's remarkable capacity for resilience. They knew they weren't being told everything. They understood why. They trusted their leaders to tell them when circumstances allowed. That trust, Churchill argued, was more valuable than any weapon. Survivors of V-2 strikes described the experience as uniquely terrifying in some ways, less frightening in others. The lack of warning meant no anticipatory dread, no sleepless nights listening for sirens. Death came instantly or not at all. There was a terrible randomness to it. You were simply in the wrong place at the wrong instant, with no warning, no time to fear, no chance to take cover. But that randomness also meant less sustained anxiety. During the Blitz, every night brought bombers. Every evening meant wondering if tonight was your turn. The V-2 could strike any time, but the strikes were sporadic. Life between explosions felt almost normal. People adapted, as humans do, to this new form of random death. One survivor, whose home was destroyed by a V-2 while she was at work, later said, "You couldn't worry about it constantly. It was like lightning. It might strike you, might not. You got on with living." That fatalism, that determination to continue despite unpredictable danger, embodied the British resilience Churchill had spent 5 years cultivating and celebrating. The technological implications continued to trouble Churchill into his later years. In his final speeches and writings, he returned repeatedly to the theme of scientific progress outpacing moral wisdom. The V-2 had been a primitive beginning. By the 1950s, thermonuclear weapons mounted on intercontinental missiles threatened total annihilation. Churchill, who had stood defiant against Nazi rockets, became an advocate for nuclear restraint and arms control. The world that emerged from World War II was shaped partly by the technologies that war developed. Radar, jet engines, computers, antibiotics, and rockets. Each began as a military tool and transformed civilian life. The V-2's descendants carried satellites that enabled global communications, GPS navigation, weather forecasting, and eventually allowed humans to walk on the moon. The weapon that killed civilians in Chiswick evolved into tools that connected humanity and expanded our reach beyond Earth. But those same descendants also became ICBMs in underground silos, submarine-launched missiles, nuclear delivery systems that could destroy entire nations in minutes. Churchill's dual legacy, the warnings about future weapons and the example of resilience against technological terror, remained relevant. How humanity would manage the powers unleashed by modern technology was the question the V-2 first posed in its crude, brutal way. The thing about the V-2 that Churchill never quite expressed publicly, the detail that haunted those who experienced it, was the sound. That boom arriving after the explosion. That sonic signature of a weapon traveling faster than its own noise. First, the blast. Then, the sound of the rocket descending. Impact before warning. Effect before cause. The natural order reversed. It violated human instinct. Throughout history, weapons announced themselves. Arrows whistled. Bullets cracked. Bombs screamed as they fell. Warning preceded impact. Humans could hear death approaching and take cover, pray, brace themselves. The V-2 denied even that small mercy. Churchill understood what that meant psychologically. The V-2 wasn't just a weapon. It was a violation of the natural order, a glimpse of a future where death could arrive without warning from distances human senses couldn't detect. It was, in its way, more modern and more terrible than nuclear weapons, which at least required aircraft or missiles that could be tracked. When he sat at his desk on September 8, 1944, feeling that tremor, hearing that delayed boom, Churchill grasped immediately that warfare had changed. Not because the explosion was large, he had survived larger. Not because the casualties were high, he had witnessed worse. But because the fundamental relationship between attack and warning had been severed. His first response, "Get me the details. Everything. And for God's sake, don't let the press know what hit them," was not about concealment for its own sake. It was about buying time to understand and respond to something genuinely new. How do you defend against weapons that arrive before their warning? How do you maintain civilian morale when shelter means nothing? How do you project confidence in the face of something you cannot counter? Churchill's answer was characteristically British. You acknowledge the threat honestly but dismiss its strategic importance. You trust your people with the truth while framing that truth in context. You refuse to grant the weapon the psychological victory it seeks. You treat space-age technology with the same contempt you'd show a medieval siege weapon. Not because it isn't dangerous, but because showing fear would be more dangerous. The V-2 killed 2,750 people in Britain. Each death mattered absolutely to families destroyed, to communities shattered, to lives ended in random instants. But the weapon failed in its larger purpose. It didn't break British morale. It didn't force political concessions. It didn't delay Allied victory by a single day. It was Hitler's most advanced weapon and his most complete failure. What Churchill said when the first V-2 struck wasn't remembered because it was eloquent or profound. It was remembered because it set the tone for everything that followed. Not panic. Not despair. Not theatrical defiance. Just practical determination to understand the threat, protect the public, and deny the enemy psychological victory. The V-2 campaign lasted 6 months. Allied armies overran the launch sites in March 1945. The last rocket fell on March 27. Germany surrendered 6 weeks later. The weapon that was supposed to turn the tide of the war became a historical footnote to the regime that created it. But the technology survived. The rockets that terrorized London in 1944 carried astronauts to the moon in 1969. The same basic engineering that delivered one-ton warheads over 200 miles eventually delivered multi-ton payloads beyond Earth's atmosphere. The V-2's terrible legacy was teaching humanity how to reach space, and teaching us that reaching space meant creating weapons against which there was no defense. Churchill saw both futures in that moment when his teacup rattled and the boom arrived after the blast. The promise and the threat. The achievement and the horror. The demonstration that human ingenuity could overcome any technical challenge, and the question of whether human wisdom could manage the consequences. In the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, on that September evening in 1944, the future announced itself. Not with a warning. Not with a chance to prepare. Just with a blast, and then the sound of arrival, and then the silence as everyone realized that warfare would never be the same. Churchill's response, practical, honest, determined, reflected the man and the moment. Not a quote for the history books. Not a speech for the ages. Just words that meant, "We see you, we understand you, we will not be frightened by you." Words that kept Britain steady through 6 months of rockets falling from space. Words that mattered not because they were memorable, but because they were exactly what Britain needed to hear from the man they trusted to lead them through the impossible. The V-2 was Hitler's revenge. Churchill's response was resilience. History records which proved more powerful,